The morning they mocked him, Wyatt Mercer didn't say a single word. He stood at that auction field, raised his hand 6 times for 6 rusted machines nobody else wanted, paid $14,200 for the lot, and walked back to his truck while the whole town laughed. Eleanor Vance said it loud enough to carry. The man had just spent his life savings on junk. The men by the fence agreed. They had all looked at the same 6 broken tractors and seen the same thing, worthless iron. Not one of them thought to look deeper. Stay with this story, because what was hiding behind those 6 tractors will forever change the way you see everything. Samuel Grant watched him go. The old auctioneer had run Grant & Associates for 31 years, working the Midwest circuit of distressed farm liquidations and estate sales, and in that time he had developed a reliable instinct for the difference between a man who didn't know what he was doing and a man who simply didn't want others to know. Samuel had met Wyatt Mercer twice before, once at a farm equipment trade conference in Ames 4 years ago, and once at a private land auction in Polk County where Wyatt had bought a parcel under an LLC name without anyone recognizing him. The old man kept that knowledge to himself on the auction floor that morning. He called the next lot and moved on with the same unhurried professionalism that had carried him through 3 decades of other people's misfortunes. Wyatt loaded the tractors across 2 days using his own tow rig and a borrowed flatbed from a man named Dale who ran a salvage yard in the next county and who asked no questions. On the way home from the second trip, Wyatt stopped at Miller's Hardware on the edge of town and bought specialty-grade bolts, 2 rolls of industrial wiring, and a set of hydraulic line fittings that the woman at the register had to look up in the back catalog because nobody had ordered them in 3 years. She glanced at the receipt, then at him, with the particular expression that Harlow Creek had recently started pointing his way. Something between pity and confusion, settling most of its weight on pity. He thanked her, picked up the bags, and loaded them into the truck cab without elaborating on anything, because he never did, and because explaining would have required starting at the beginning, and the beginning was not where Harlow Creek was ready to go. By Sunday morning, the story of the 6 tractors had completed its full circuit through town. It passed through Sycamore Cup during the early coffee hour, moved into the First Baptist parking lot between the 8:30 and 10 o'clock services, spent some time in the parking lot of Vance & Sons Hardware, where a few men stood by their trucks and offered their own assessments, and settled at last in the corner booth of Harlow Creek Diner, where Eleanor Vance held court with 2 members of the Commerce Board over a plate of eggs she had no intention of eating. Eleanor told the story well. She had a gift for framing, for taking a set of facts and presenting them in an order that made the conclusion feel obvious and inevitable, even when the facts themselves were incomplete. Each retelling she gave stripped a little more generosity from the details and added a little more certainty to the judgment, the way a story does when the teller already knows how she wants it to end. By the time Diana Brooks arrived and took the adjacent table with her notebook and a black coffee, the consensus in the diner had solidified into something close to verdict. Wyatt Mercer was a man who had come back from a city job in Chicago 3 years ago, bought his family's old acreage at a price nobody thought made sense, and had been quietly making poor decisions ever since. The grief of losing his wife 4 years back had clearly taken something from him that hadn't come back. Everyone agreed this was sad. Nobody said it was their business to look closer. Diana wrote one line in her notebook, WM $14,200, 6 tractors, why, and underlined the last word without a question mark, the way she did when something was less a request for information and more a refusal to let a thing alone. She was still looking at that underline when a man in a gray linen jacket and clean leather shoes walked in and sat alone at the counter and ordered black coffee. He did not look like anyone who had ever driven a tractor in his life, and in Harlow Creek, where the agricultural economy was woven into the texture of everything, that was a detail worth noting. He had the particular composure of someone who was visiting rather than passing through, the quiet attentiveness of a person measuring a room, cataloging its occupants, storing information for later use. Diana added his face to her notes without knowing why. His name was Carter Voss. He was 52 years old and ran a real estate development firm out of Des Moines with 12 employees and 3 active regional projects. He had been studying Harlow Creek from a distance for 6 months, reviewing county records, GIS land use data, infrastructure planning documents, and quarterly agricultural yield reports, before deciding it was time to come in person. He was interested in 340 acres of land in the northern corridor of the county, currently registered to a Wyatt Mercer, which sat at the geographic center of a logistic infrastructure project his firm was developing in partnership with a regional distribution consortium that needed a ground hub between Des Moines and Cedar Rapids. The land was worth roughly $400,000 by current county assessment. Carter had come prepared to offer considerably more. He had also come prepared to make the situation uncomfortable enough that a man in Wyatt Mercer's apparent circumstances, a single father running a modest operation on land that was costing him more than it was clearly returning, might find the comfortable exit more appealing than the continued fight. What the town of Harlow Creek did not know about the land north of Elm Creek Road was almost everything that mattered. From the road, the property looked as it always had. Wire fence running along the shoulder, a gravel lane cutting full through low trees toward a farmhouse that needed a coat of paint, and beyond that, open fields in various states of the agricultural year. Nothing about the view suggested anything different from the dozen other working farms visible from the same stretch of highway. This was not an oversight. It was not laziness. It was a deliberate choice Wyatt had made early on. Not out of secrecy for its own sake, but from a simple recognition that explanation requires an audience ready to understand, and he had not yet seen evidence that Harlow Creek was that audience. He had grown up in this town. He knew the way it listened and the way it talked about what it had heard, and he had decided a long time ago that the work itself was a more efficient use of his energy than the managing of other people's expectations about the work. The workshop behind the main house was where the 6 tractors were brought, one by one, over 4 days. It was a large structure, the only part of the property Wyatt had significantly expanded in his first year back. With overhead LED lighting running the full length of the ceiling, a concrete floor with drainage channels poured along both walls, and a workbench that extended from the door to the far corner loaded with organized tools, 2 laptop stands, component trays sorted by part type, and 3 monitors connected live to the sensor network running across the property outside. When the 6th tractor rolled in on a Tuesday evening and Wyatt closed the workshop doors, he stood in the fluorescent stillness and looked at the 6 machines arranged in 2 rows of 3, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has been waiting to begin a specific task for a specific reason that no one around him yet fully understands. The first row, the John Deere, the KCH, and a Massey Ferguson sourced from a foreclosed property in Lynn County, had engines that were beyond economical repair. Wyatt had known this before he bid on them. What he also knew, because he had spent 300 hours over the previous 5 months identifying every machine on the Cedar Falls auction list that fit his exact requirements, was that their hydraulic systems were structurally sound, that the PTO shafts could be reconditioned to spec, and that their chassis carried the precise frame geometry he needed for the custom mounting hardware he had already drawn and partially fabricated in anticipation of winning them. They were not tractors to him. They were component assemblies in a vehicle form he intended to dismantle and redistribute. The second row, a John Deere 4040 from a different generation, a Ford 8N that had been sitting in covered dry storage and needed less attention than its surface condition suggested, and a late model utility case with a hydraulic fault that was simpler to correct than the price tag reflected, had engines that would run again with the right attention given in the right sequence. 3 machines would give him parts. 3 machines would become the mechanical core of something the agricultural engineering trade press had already taken notice of, even if Harlow Creek had not. Wyatt spent 2 weeks on initial assessment and began fabrication on the 3rd week, working mostly after dark because the days were still full of the 100 tasks that kept the larger operation running. There was a flashback that lived in the corner of his mind during those late hours. Not a painful one, not anymore, just present the way certain memories become present during quiet work. It was Laura, at the kitchen table in their Chicago apartment, a map of the Iowa county spread out between them. She had looked at the acreage numbers and then at him and said, with the specific kind of trust that has thought something through and arrived on the other side of doubt, "I don't fully understand what you see out there, Wyatt, but I trust that you see it." He had never needed to hear it again after that. He heard it anyway, sometimes in the workshop at 2 in the morning. The night after the auction, while the story of his $14,000 purchase was completing its first circuit around Harlow Creek, Wyatt opened an email that had been sitting in his inbox for 11 days. It was from a company called AgriCore Solutions, headquartered in Minneapolis, a mid-sized agricultural technology firm with a strong position in the precision farming sector. They had been tracking publicly available sensor telemetry data from the county environmental monitoring grid for over a year and had identified patterns consistent with a large-scale, professionally installed precision agriculture network operating in the northern Cedar County corridor. They wanted to arrange a site visit. They were prepared, subject to verification of what the data suggested, to discuss a strategic partnership. Wyatt read it twice. He closed the laptop and went back to the hydraulic line he was fitting to the John Deere chassis. He would answer it. But not that night. There was still a sequence to things, and it was not yet time. Carter Voss found Wyatt at Sycamore Cup on a Tuesday morning and sat down across from him without being invited. He introduced himself with the practiced ease of a man who had done this in a great many towns and had learned that directness, framed correctly, reads as a form of respect. He explained his firm in broad terms. He outlined the development project without specifying its full scope or its intended relationship to the northern corridor. He told Wyatt he was prepared to offer $1,200,000 for the 340 primary acres, nearly 3 times the current assessed value, and that the offer, while generous, would not be available indefinitely. He made it sound like a favor being offered before someone else could claim it. He spoke for roughly 4 minutes without pause. When he finished, Wyatt set down his coffee cup, held Carter's gaze for a long moment with an expression that communicated absolutely nothing beyond attentiveness, and said, "No thank you." Carter waited for the elaboration that would give him something to work with. None came. He tried a second approach. The land was commercially underutilized at any meaningful scale. The region was in a period of structural economic transition. The infrastructure project represented an opportunity that would elevate property values for every landowner in the northern corridor, and Wyatt should think carefully about what his goals actually were before passing on a number like this. Wyatt listened to the entire second version with the same expression he had used for the first. Then he said, "I appreciate the offer," stood up, put on his jacket, and walked out. Carter sat for a moment in the quiet of the coffee shop, looking at the door, and did the kind of thinking that successful developers do when their first and most comfortable tool does not produce the expected result. That evening he drove to Vance & Sons after closing time, and Eleanor met him at the side door. What passed between them over the next 40 minutes was not a conspiracy in any dramatic sense. No maps were spread on tables, no explicit instructions were given, no specific outcomes were named out loud. It was more the natural convergence of 2 people who recognized a shared interest and chose to act on it through the comfortable medium of implication. Carter explained his interest in the northern acreage without disclosing the logistics project's full strategic value. He noted, almost as an aside, that organized community attention, zoning compliance requests, formal questions about operational permits, and official inspection request had a tendency, in his experience, to bring clarity to situations where property owners were perhaps not giving their own options fair consideration. He mentioned that a successfully concluded development project in the northern corridor would create commercial anchor effects that historically benefited established local supply businesses, including agricultural retail. Eleanor did not ask him to specify what that meant for Vance & Sons. She had been running a business in a small market for long enough to do that arithmetic herself. She told Carter that there had already been genuine questions in the community about what exactly was happening on the Mercer property, and that those questions deserved formal, official answers. She believed that when she said it. She was not entirely wrong. But she also understood the use to which formal, official pressure was being pointed, and she did not raise an objection to that understanding. Diana Brooks was walking past the side entrance of Vance & Sons at 8:45 that same night, returning from a school board meeting 2 blocks away. Through the glass panel, she saw Eleanor and the man from the diner counter standing near the back of the showroom floor in conversation. She recorded the time in her notebook and continued walking. She had run Carter Voss's name when she got home. Des Moines Development Firm, 12 employees, 3 active regional projects in central Iowa at various permitting stages. She did not yet understand why that was relevant to anything happening in Harlow Creek. She filed it and went to sleep. The instinct that told her to file it at all was the same instinct that had kept her notebook employed for 6 years. The formal notice arrived at Wyatt's address on a Wednesday by registered mail from the Harlow Creek Commerce and Zoning Advisory Board. It cited concerns regarding unauthorized agricultural land use modifications, raised questions about whether the installation of extensive subsurface infrastructure met existing county agricultural zoning classifications, and requested an on-site inspection within 14 days. The notice was signed by Eleanor Vance in her capacity as board chair. It was written in the careful, measured language of official concern, the kind that is nearly impossible to object to directly because it never quite says what it intends, only what it is willing to put in writing. Wyatt read it at the kitchen table with his coffee cooling beside him and the gray morning light coming through the window over the sink. He read it once, then again. He set it flat on the table, not face down, not pushed to the side, but flat, like a document he intended to address on his own terms at a time of his own choosing. Marcus came downstairs a few minutes later, moving through the kitchen with the particular quiet that teenagers develop in houses where the emotional register of the adults around them requires attentiveness. He was 16, tall, already starting to carry himself the way his father carried himself. The unhurried, self-contained way of a person who does not need external confirmation to know where he stands. He saw the notice on the table. He looked at Wyatt. "Dad," he said, keeping his voice carefully level, "they're not going to make us leave, are they?" Wyatt looked up at his son, at the effort behind the neutrality in the boy's face, the careful concealment of something that was in fact quite worried, and said simply and without hesitation, "No, we're not leaving." Marcus held his father's gaze for a moment, nodded once, poured himself a coffee, and went back upstairs. That was the end of it between them. That evening Wyatt composed his reply to Agricore Solutions, brief, direct, confirming a site visit 3 weeks out, attaching a 12-page operational summary of the Mercer Precision Ag system, and closing with his attorney's contact information for preliminary documentation review. He sent it at 7:43 and then called Jonathan Reed in Chicago at 8:15. Reed had handled corporate contract work for Wyatt during his years at Agristar and had an informed familiarity with the ways in which development interests operated in rural Midwest land markets. Wyatt gave him Carter Voss's name and firm and the general outline of what had transpired at the coffee shop. Reed was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I've come across that operation before, in Jasper County. Send me everything you have on his Cedar County activity, filings, any public statements, the conversation as you remember it." Wyatt said he would. He hung up and looked out the window at the dark field where the sensor lights blinked in their steady intervals, like a quiet heartbeat spread across 800 acres. He was not alarmed by any of what was happening. He was simply done allowing the situation to move at someone else's pace. Eleanor's community meeting took place that Thursday in the town hall's main room, attended by roughly 40 residents who had come partly out of genuine civic concern and partly out of the same curiosity that had been circling Wyatt Mercer since the auction. Eleanor framed it as a transparency initiative, a community conversation about land use decisions that affected everyone in the Northern Corridor. The questions that came from floor were honest, if uninformed. What was being built on that land? Was it properly permitted? Were there environmental implications that should concern neighboring farms? Why had none of this been communicated through normal channels? Eleanor provided no answers because she had none to give. What she provided was a forum for the community's unease, which was real enough, and a sense that someone in an official capacity was paying attention, which was the part that served Carter Voss's purpose. The meeting ran an hour and ended with nothing resolved and everything slightly more unsettled than it had been when people walked in. Wyatt was not there. At that hour he was in the workshop fitting a GPS receiver housing to the chassis of the 4th tractor, his hands working the bracket bolts in the particular rhythmic focus of a person who is thinking 3 stages ahead of his hands. Diana Brooks had covered Harlow Creek for 6 years and had developed in that time a reliable sense for the difference between stories that were what they appeared to be and stories that only looked that way from a specific angle. The Wyatt Mercer story had started in her notebook as the first kind. A man makes a purchase that doesn't make obvious sense. The town has opinions about it, human interest, write it soft and move on. She had a dozen of those a year. But something kept pulling at the frame. A low, persistent friction between what the story looked like and something she couldn't name yet. And after the community meeting, which she had attended and which had left her with more questions than answers, and a stronger sense that something important was being misread by everyone in the room, she decided to go back to the beginning and pull the thread that had been bothering her since the auction. She went to the county recorder's office on a Friday morning and requested the full land ownership index for the northern residential and agricultural corridor. What she found took 2 hours to fully trace, and at the end of those 2 hours, she sat very still at the research table for a long time before she wrote anything down. Wyatt Mercer personally held 340 acres, which was known. But 3 separate LLCs registered in Iowa, Mercer Land Holdings, Cedar Line Ag, and North Tract Properties, held 6 additional parcels of land in the same northern corridor, all acquired over the previous 3 years, all structured as routine agricultural land sales between private parties, none of them generating local press coverage because there was nothing in any individual transaction to draw attention. The parcels were contiguous. Combined, they totaled just under 1,800 acres. Diana wrote the number in her notebook and sat with it for a long time before making any calls. She found Samuel Grant the following afternoon at his office behind the auction yard. A small, paper-dense room with a window looking out over the empty staging field and a filing cabinet against the far wall that appeared to be organized according to a system only Samuel fully understood. She asked him directly whether he had known Wyatt Mercer before the day of the auction. Samuel looked at her with the particular patience of a man who has been waiting for a specific question from a specific kind of person and has learned not to force it. He said quietly and without elaboration, "Do you know what those 6 tractors are worth, if you know how to look at them?" He did not answer her question. He stood, went to the second drawer of the filing cabinet, retrieved a copy of a trade journal, Midwest Ag Intelligence, published 18 months prior, and set it on the desk in front of her without opening it. He sat back down and picked up his tea. Page 3. The headline read, Mercer Precision Ag, the quiet revolution happening in Iowa's heartland. Below it, an aerial photograph taken from a drone at altitude, 1,800 acres, sensor arrays visible from above like a precisely drawn grid, automated irrigation infrastructure in parallel geometric lines across the field surface, and 3 modified tractors moving in synchronized formation along programmed routes. No drivers in the cabs, no human presence anywhere in the frame, just 3 machines working in absolute self-directed order across a landscape that looked nothing like a struggling family farm and everything like the quietly operational future of something very large. The article was 2,400 words. Diana read every one of them sitting in Samuel Grant's office while the old man drank his tea and looked out the window at the empty staging field as if the conversation were already over, and everything that needed to happen was simply happening on schedule. When she finished, she set the journal down, stood, thanked him, and walked out to her car. She called her editor from the parking lot and said, "Hold 2 columns Thursday, I have something." She paused. "It's not a small something." The morning of the inspection was clear and cool in the particular way of late May in Iowa after a week of rain, a freshness in the air that arrives with the specific quality of patience rewarded, of something that has been waiting and has finally been given permission to begin. Eleanor Vance reached the gate of the Mercer property at 9 o'clock in a county vehicle with 2 members of the zoning advisory board seated behind her. Carter Voss arrived 2 minutes later in his own car, a late-model black sedan that looked conspicuously clean on the county road, and was introduced to the board members as a regional agricultural land use consultant whose familiarity with zoning statutes in comparable rural development contexts would, Eleanor said, be useful in evaluating what they found. The gate was closed and latched. They waited for a few minutes in the cool morning air, not speaking much, looking at the fence line and the gravel lane disappearing into the low trees beyond it. Wyatt came down the lane on foot, unhurried, wearing his work clothes, the same canvas work pants and dark flannel he wore on any other morning, the same boots that had drawn comments at the auction. He unlatched the gate and held it open. He shook hands with Eleanor and each of the board members in turn, without hesitation, without warmth or coldness, simply the straightforward acknowledgement of one adult to another. He shook Carter Voss's hand last and held the man's gaze for a half-second longer than necessary, and Carter held it back with the composure of a professional who had been in rooms where he was not entirely welcome before and had learned to project certainty regardless. Wyatt said nothing about Carter's presence. He turned and walked back up the lane, and the inspection party followed. They came around the last stand of low trees at the bend in the lane, and the property opened before them all at once, and what they saw was not what any of them had prepared themselves to find. Eleanor stopped walking. She stood at the edge of what she was looking at and understood, in the space of several seconds, that she had been constructing her picture of this land from the wrong materials entirely. The inspection party stood at the threshold of 1,800 acres of precision-managed farmland, and the visible scale of it, the organized, fully operational, evidently intentional scale of it, was so far from the image of a struggling single father burning through modest savings on worthless equipment that the gap between the 2 pictures was briefly disorienting. Sensor poles rose at regular intervals across the fields, small and silver, fitted with multi-array monitoring heads that caught the morning light at their tips. The irrigation infrastructure ran as low-profile hosing along the crop row margins, connected to a buried network visible only in the regular geometry of its distribution, the even spacing that machines make when they have been told exactly where to go. In the eastern section, 3 tractors moved along parallel routes with the slow, deliberate steadiness of machines executing instructions, no one in the cabs, no engine sound carrying at this distance, just 3 converted hulls moving through the morning in absolute geometric order. In the far distance, a greenhouse structure of significant size, 12,000 square feet minimum, sat adjacent to a low operations building with dark glass along the front elevation and a satellite communications array on the roof. Carter Voss said nothing. He had gone very still in the way that people go still when they are rerunning numbers and the numbers keep arriving at the same conclusion. Wyatt led them into the operations building through the side door. A single room of approximately 800 square feet, cool and softly lit, lined along the north wall with 24 monitoring screens displaying live sensor feeds, weather and moisture overlays, equipment GPS position data, commodity inventory tracking, and an interface that appeared to be logging several hundred data points per minute from across the full property. The center of the room held a long table with 2 active workstations and a color printer still warm from the morning's run. Along the east wall, organized binders and equipment specification documents were arranged with the methodical precision of a person who has worked the same system every day for years and has never needed to search for anything. Wyatt walked to the center table and picked up a blue-covered folder that had been placed there before the inspection party arrived. He opened it and turned it to face them across the table. He did not offer it to Carter. He set it on the table so that everyone in the room could read it. Page 1. The Iowa Department of Agriculture Agricultural Innovation Land Use Permit, issued 23 months ago and bearing the signatures of the relevant county and state reviewers. Page 2. The Environmental Protection Agency Environmental Compliance Certification for the full subsurface sensor network installation. Pages 3 through 7. Complete county zoning approval documentation, reviewed, signed and filed under the prior board chair's administration, a chair whose tenure had overlapped with Eleanor's by 14 months and whose filing system she had apparently not reviewed when she drafted the inspection notice. Page 8. A third-party operational safety audit completed 8 months prior, findings satisfactory across all categories reviewed. Page 9. An independent environmental impact assessment conclusion. No adverse impact detected or projected. Operational methods recommended as model for regional adoption. Page 10 was a single document that Wyatt allowed the inspection party to read in full without offering any commentary. It was a strategic partnership and licensing agreement between Mercer Precision Ag and AgriCore Solutions of Minneapolis. The initial phase value was stated on page 1 of the agreement, plainly and without ambiguity, $47 million, with provisions for extension to a second and third phase contingent on first phase performance benchmarks. The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. Carter Voss was the first to speak. He began with the precise, careful language of a man who still has one more position to try before he accepts the situation. Corner case provisions in the agricultural modification statutes, interpretive ambiguities in the county classification framework, potential conflicts between the precision agriculture designation and the underlying residential agricultural zoning layer. He made it sound technical and procedural, the kind of issue that requires extended review and creates delay and uncertainty, which was really the point of it. Wyatt listened to all of it with the same closed, unhurried expression he had used at the coffee shop on Tuesday morning. When Carter reached the end of his second point, Wyatt turned his head and looked at him with the directness of a man who has decided that the time for indirectness has passed and is not coming back. Everything in that folder has been legal, permitted, and compliant for 2 years, he said. His voice was conversational, not hard, not raised. The documents are yours to copy if you'd like. My attorney's contact is on the back of the cover page. He let a beat pass. I also know what you proposed to Eleanor Vance. I don't have a recording of that conversation. But Jonathan Reed in Chicago has been reviewing your Cedar County acquisition filings for the past 3 weeks, and he has questions for your legal team that I think you should be aware of. I'd suggest returning his call before the end of the week. Something changed in Carter Voss's expression. Not fear, not panic, something quieter and more final than either of those. The specific blankness of a man who has just understood the actual situation he is in, as distinguished from the situation he believed he was managing. He picked up his jacket from the chair where he had draped it, said nothing to the room, and moved toward the door. Wyatt said levelly before Carter reached the threshold, "If you want to do legitimate business in this region, real business, the actual kind, have your firm contact Jonathan Reed. There may be something worth discussing." Carter left without responding. The sound of the sedan's engine starting outside was the last time anyone in Harlow Creek would hear it. Eleanor stood near the monitoring wall after the others had filed out. She looked at the screens, the sensor data scrolling across its feeds, the tractor position markers updating as the three machines made their slow turns at the field boundary and began their return pass. The weather forecast for the next 72 hours already loaded and integrated into the irrigation scheduling algorithm that was running quietly in the background without requiring anyone's attention or instruction. She looked at the blue folder still open on the center table. She looked at Wyatt, who had moved to stand at the window on the far side of the room, looking out at the fields with no particular expression, not triumphant, not bitter, not performing any version of what the moment might have entitled him to perform. She stood there for a while, then she walked out without saying anything, and the drive back through town was the longest 40 minutes of Eleanor Vance's professional life. Diana Brooks's article ran on Thursday morning in print and online under the headline, "The Farm Nobody Saw." It was 3,100 words, the longest piece the Harlow Creek Gazette had published in 4 years, and it carried the aerial photograph from the trade journal reproduced on the front page with permission, and a full accounting of the property assembly through the LLC structure, the 3-year construction of the sensor and automation network, the AgriCore Solutions partnership, and the total valuation. $100 million combining land value, fully installed precision agriculture infrastructure, contracted revenue streams under the AgriCore agreement, and the system licensing value established by the partnership terms. Diana had verified every figure through 3 independent sources before she allowed her editor to run the number. It was accurate. The town received it the way small towns receive information that requires a fundamental reassessment of something they believed they understood. Slowly at first, then all at once, with a particular quality of silence in the early hours that is different from ordinary quiet, and that anyone who has lived in a place long enough can recognize as the sound of a community reconsidering itself. By mid-morning the diner was full and louder than it usually was on a Thursday, but somehow less comfortable than usual, because the conversation filling it had a specific texture, the texture of a room full of people who all know they are remembering the same moment from the same awkward angle, the auction, the laughter that had moved through the crowd like a wave, the thing Eleanor had said just loud enough to carry. People remembered it differently now. A few said plainly they had been wrong. Others found different framings. A handful got quieter than they had been before and stayed that way. Carter Voss was not seen in Harlow Creek again. His development firm issued a brief statement 2 weeks later confirming that the Cedar County Logistics project had been restructured pending environmental reassessment and revised feasibility modeling. Jonathan Reed did not discuss publicly what his review of the Cedar County acquisition filings had produced. He did not need to. Eleanor Vance came to the Mercer property on Friday afternoon alone. She parked at the gate and walked the full length of the lane herself, and Wyatt met her at the door of the operations building because the camera feed had shown her car turn in from the road. She stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment with the expression of a person who has rehearsed a thing several times and has decided that rehearsal was the wrong approach, that the only honest version of it is the unrehearsed one. She said, "I was wrong." 3 words, level and unambiguous, with nothing added to soften them or redirect them or explain them away. Wyatt held her gaze for a moment, long enough to take the full measure of what it had cost her to stand in that doorway, which was not a small thing, not in a town the size of Harlow Creek where a person's reputation is a structure they live in whether they want to or not. Then he said, "You can still run a good business here, Eleanor. This town needs people like you, if you choose to stand in the right place." She held his gaze for a moment after that. Then she nodded, once, turned and walked back down the lane to her car. Late that same afternoon, Marcus drove the old pickup out to the far eastern field where Wyatt was standing at the edge of the last automated run of the day. The boy parked along the field track and climbed out and walked over and stood beside his father without speaking, without asking what they were looking at, because he already knew. He had grown up watching this place become what it was, even if he hadn't always understood the full shape of it. The sky had gone orange and deep red at the horizon in the way Iowa skies go in May, when the open land and the failing light conspire to make the ordinary look like something that should be committed to memory. The three converted tractors moved in slow formation across the middle distance, following their programmed lines with the patient, unhurried certainty of machines that have been given clear instructions and are content to execute them without comment. No engine sound carried over the wind at this distance. No one would have known, watching from the road, that those machines were doing anything but moving. Father and son stood together in the last of the light, and neither of them spoke, and there was nothing that needed saying. People in Harlow Creek would tell the story of the 6 tractors for a long time after that Thursday. They would tell it with a particular enthusiasm, the kind that carries just below its surface the slight embarrassment of having been so completely and confidently wrong, and they would tell it in ways that cast themselves as surprised observers rather than participants in the laughing crowd. The way memory tends to work when a story ends differently than expected. Most of them would never fully understand what they had actually missed. It had not been a secret kept behind locked doors. It had not been a trick or a deliberate misdirection. What they had missed was simpler, and in some ways harder to reckon with. They had looked at a man and decided, based on the surface data of his truck and his boots and the quiet economy of his presence in their town, that they already understood the full dimensions of him. They had stood in a field of evidence and seen only rust. They had heard silence and translated it as absence. They had watched a man refuse to explain himself and concluded that he had nothing worth explaining. They had laughed on an April morning at the Cedar Falls auction, and the echo of that laughter had followed them through every sentence of Diana Brooks's article and every mile of Eleanor's drive home on the Thursday it ran. And it was still there in the corner of the room at the diner on Friday morning when the conversation had moved on, but the feeling had not quite. He had never been angry with them. He had never needed them to understand him. He had only needed the land and the work and the particular kind of patience that builds something real in the long, quiet dark before anyone is ready to look.